Hello, denizens of the night. Welcome to Carnophage. I am Ignacio Vitalis, and I regret to inform everyone that I am in fact a Redditor. It's a forum for discussion, I suppose, and I've occasionally seen the question of where's everyone else in the 5th edition of the World of Darkness. Everyone besides vampires and werewolves, I mean. The supernaturals from different game lines have historically never really understood each other, so all that we hear is somewhat limited by perspective. Kindred only know lupines as monsters who slaughter them, and Garou only know vampires as unwitting servants of the worm. Everyone has opinions on everyone, but they're not always baseless, and by reading between the lines, it's not difficult to get a somewhat clear picture of the greater world of darkness through the perspectives of Kindred, Garou, and a few insightful humans. Here's what we know about the other supernaturals in the 5th edition of the World of Darkness, according to the accounts from complete outsiders. For mages, the traditions still seem to exist given how they're capitalized in the 5th edition core rulebook for Vampire the Masquerade. Unsurprisingly, the books are unlikely to say very much about the technocracy, but there are 3 separate leads. The first one is very minor, and it's from the Week of Nightmares lore sheet in Vampire. Here we get the line, "The Ravnos Antediluvian met final death in July 1999 at the hands of parties unknown, armed with advanced weaponry and the power of the sun." This suggests that the technocracy's involvement in the Week of Nightmares is more or less unchanged from its classic depictions. The more substantive leads are in the Incognito Report sourcebook for Hunter the Reckoning. This book features 2 quarries, Prophet and Timur. With Prophet, he's a mage specializing in technomancy, and seems to be under a morbidity quiet after having a vision of humanity's doomed future. This event, followed by his advocacy to forcefully evolve humanity to a state that could survive the coming apocalypse, pushed him away from the coven of fellow technomancers he was with, and is what set him on the path to become a quarry. Otherwise, he's going to keep forcing people into becoming subjects for his evolutionary experiments, and he's probably also on track to becoming a marauder. For a long while, I actually considered this part of his backstory as a clue of Prophet formerly being involved with the virtual adepts. But 2 things stood out to me when I was checking the book again for this video. The first is the mention that through his connections with the Coven, he was able to get powerful positions in electronics corporations, which doesn't quite sound like something a virtual adept would do. They're generally more punkish. The second is that he's become paranoid about his coven coming back for him, so he constantly keeps a low profile. In fact, he seems to be more worried about them than mortal hunters. I believe this makes sense if he was working with the virtual adepts, but hiding like this would especially make sense if he was working with Iteration X. Due to this kind of background, it's unsurprising that it gets downplayed in the Hunter book, but there would be something ironic about how his attempts to stay under the technocracy's radar have actually made him a target for mortal hunters. This makes more sense if you read the book. But moving on, the other clue is from the same book, and is the final big bad quarry, Timur, who was created by a group of occultists working in the US government to condense the fears of a nation into a single entity that could be manipulated. This was a horrible idea, but they succeeded and were the first to get attacked by their creation. Now this monster is trying to sow terror and find allies, or at least minions, to aid its mission. To preface another important excerpt, I'll explain that the Cognistas are a group of conspiracy theorists that are somewhat aware of the supernatural thanks to a whistleblower within the American wing of the Coalition. With that out of the way, the excerpt reads, "A significant faction of the Cognistas doesn't recognize Timur as an entity in its own right. They assume Timur is a code name or a project. They suspect a coven of sorcerers at work somewhere in the heart of the government, though they can't agree on how powerful those hypothetical sorcerers might be. Is the country secretly run by a coven of witches, or are Timur's creators overworked public servants in it for the pension? Status aside, they're partially correct, just a few years out of date." Not only does Timur sound like something the New World Order would try to cook up at their lowest, this excerpt also heavily implies the existence of something like the technocracy and it's safe to assume that it is just a technocracy. I'm also not sure how much we should consider the difference between a mage and a sorcerer in a book written from a perspective where that difference is very esoteric knowledge. It's kind of weird to say that we have a clearer impression of the technocracies and their traditions, but we'll probably also get a 5th edition of Mage within the next 3 years for more details. Editing Iggy here, so I just remembered that in Bloodlines 2 there's a side quest where you deliver something from a Tremere to an associate going by Mr. Swan. When you get to him, the encounter goes as follows.
You are Mr. Swan?
May your luck serve you well.
Well, that was weird. Guess we should go see Mrs. T.
He's definitely a mage, perhaps a rogue hermeticist, but there's too little in this encounter to draw any more substantial conclusions. That seems to be the extent of what we know for the mages, so I'll move on to the Changelings, which proves to be a more complicated yet smaller topic to unravel. The Vampire the Masquerade core rulebook specifically provides a Sidhe for its example fairy, and the Hunter the Reckoning core rulebook mentions glamour-seeking entities at the edges of reality, in a section about the Arcanum. In that book, we also get a quarry going by the name of Johnny Sweets, under the category of Fair Folk and Stranger Things. Johnny is a man who has been trying to find true love over multiple eras, and has moved his search into online dating. He's gone through multiple potential partners as he inevitably finds something unsatisfying about them, so he turns them into portraits and substitutes them with a fetch to stay under the radar. He also has the support of some otherworldly patrons which he has to regularly appease, and the most peculiar detail is that he does not have a vulnerability to cold iron. Don't get me wrong, the pursuit of true love is prime unfeely shit, but this doesn't sound like a changeling from Changeling the Dreaming. In particular, the mention of fetches sounds more like the doppelgangers the True Fae replaced the changelings with in Changelings Lost. Additionally, we can look to the Lines Drawn in Blood Chronicle book, which features a hunt all about fairies. One of its quarries can reluctantly be assumed to be some kind of nightmare chimera, but the rest of the fairies are nothing like the changelings. In fact, the hunt has a pretty traditional depiction of folkloric fairies. There's a young eccentric noble, her loyal dashing knight, and an army of diminutive creatures at their command. The Alma Mater sourcebook also features some fairy splits between 2 hunts. In the first hunt, we have the Peripheral Man, which is some kind of fairy monster that is stuck in its side of reality but desires to experience our mortal world. It does this through possessed hosts which need to be exposed to a specific chemical compound, however this possession slowly exhausts the host. It can also only be destroyed by exposure to mirrors, as each time its reflection is caught on a mirror, it tears away a portion of its essence. With this origin story in mind, I kind of like the idea of the Peripheral Man being one of the True Fae who stayed in Arcadia and is now trying to poke their head into the Autumn World, but this is all pure speculation. In the other hunt, we have something called a Boggart, but it's more like a standard folkloric monster than anything one might associate with fairies. In fact, it's not even quite like the real Boggart of folklore, and it's absolutely nothing like the Boggart Saulain. It also does not have a vulnerability to cold iron. Along with the Boggart are a pack of other fairy monsters that are described as, quote, a little like humans if humans were loping predators with long limbs, sharp claws, and crowns of antlers. These monsters actually do have a vulnerability to cold iron. At the end of the book, there's a list of sample locations for hunting, and one of the locations talks about traditional changelings being pursued by traditional fairies for escaping their realm, and with this, I believe the intention is laid bare. 5th edition is not ignorant of Changeling the Dreaming, and when the 5th edition does come out, it probably won't be made in ignorance of its themes, but its aesthetics are probably going to be heavily redone. Perhaps it will allow for Changeling to be more tonally in line with all the other game lines, as Changeling the Lost is to the rest of the Chronicles of Darkness, and it will do some justice to fairies as gothic monsters. Honestly, when I look at the two game lines, Changeling the Lost feels like it does far more for fairies than Changeling the Dreaming, but it also looks like a lot can be lost in the translation. At the least for Werewolf, the changes that stayed in the final version largely stem from looking at climate change as a far more serious issue than the original editions. I don't think a 5th edition Changeling could come up with such a reason for making far more drastic changes without aggravating fans of the original game. Now, let's jump onto something that's potentially less controversial. Not everyone wants to play Wraiths, but the idea is undoubtedly pretty cool. Unfortunately, this game was blown up early, with the Ends of Empire book and some events from the summer of 1999, including the 6th Great Maelstrom, have remained relevant in the 5th edition setting. Surprisingly, Wraiths to Oblivion got a whole video game in the form of Afterlife, a remarkably faithful and rather janky VR horror game that follows someone awakening into a harrowing. It's not super detailed, but a lot of what one should expect is there. In Vampire the Masquerade, the Cults of the Blood God sourcebook provides some details on how the Hecata understand the Underworld, and most of the important parts are still there. We have the Shadowlands, the Necropoli, the Tempest, the Labyrinth, and Oblivion underneath it all. The Hecata generally steer clear of the Necropoli because they don't make many friends among the race, but they're still there. The fact that there are Necropoli puts the severity of the 6th Great Maelstrom into question, but I posit that it did still happen, primarily because of a scoop from another book. In the Hunter the Reckoning core rulebook, one of the quarries is William Foster, a captain of an American slave ship who was cursed by a powerful race from Africa to hunt anyone who dares to brandish the Confederate flag and similar hate symbols by setting them ablaze. For the last important bit of context, here's an excerpt from the core rulebook. The moment Foster died, they cursed his ghost to do their bidding until justice came for those stolen souls. The afterlife being the strange place it is, Foster spent ages in service to an arcane bureaucracy that he neither understood nor chose, until it dissolved. Free, he thought, but no, for he was still bound by the curse. It would be unsurprising for one of the Dark Kingdoms to throw a curse onto someone who is a monster in life, and Foster would likely fall under Stygia's purview. I am aware of the dictum mortem, however within the context of the whole book, it sounds like he was enslaved under the hierarchy and now that it's gone, he's been unleashed to hunt for racists. The book proposes that there have been documented encounters with the so-called Burning Captain, but not over a century of records, which we would get if he was violating the dictum mortem ever since he died. All that is to say that the passage I just read heavily suggests that the Stygian hierarchy is gone. That will probably prove to be a somewhat controversial decision, but it might also allow for a more focused game where players can experience ghost stories from the perspective of ghosts. We still have the Necropoli, so there is a greater society for Chronicles to be built around, so I'm not sure if there's that much that would be lost from trying to rebuild Wraiths to Oblivion as a game without Stygia. It's not like the Legions were inseparable from character creation, unless you wanted to play Stygia-centric Chronicles. So, that's everything I've been able to find so far. Changelings are likely to be pulled into a different direction, more influenced by their Chronicles of Darkness counterpart. Mages are hanging out, and the Wraiths are hanging on. As for everyone else, 5th edition vampires sidestepped overtly mentioning the Quajin when talking about the Week of Nightmares, and every other mention of vampires in Asia only talks about Cainites, so it's safe to assume that the Quajin are gone. Ditto for the Imbued, who have not been mentioned at all. However, that isn't to say that there aren't interesting developments among mortal monster hunters. Some of the weird ancient Egypt stuff is probably still around. The Silent Strider tribe being cursed by Set is still on the table, though I wouldn't go from there to saying expect 5th edition Mummy in the near future. We probably shouldn't even expect the Children of Osiris at all. I find it remarkably strange that Abrahamic-style demons have been danced around but never done 5th edition, as demons are one of those classic gothic monsters, but perhaps the implications of such monsters are too grand for the setting to currently handle. In short, we have nothing for the demons of Demon the Fallen. I suppose the cupola is still canon, but That monster has always been a can of worms. Well, that's all, folks. I would be lying if I said I feel no disappointment when looking at all this information, and I did live through being interested to see what Paradox was going to do with the Bali and Tattered Facade before being very, very underwhelmed. But they didn't have a creative director for the World of Darkness until very recently. If there's a time to expect change, that would be right about now. And if you don't quite trust Paradox or the new White Wolf, check out the homebrew works of Yoga RPG. They have made rules for playing Mage, Changeling, Wraiths, Mummy, and Demon, if you just want to play in those worlds with 5th edition's rules. I'll link what they have available below. They even made one for Werewolf before its 5th edition release, though that one is harder to find. So, for every game that isn't Vampire, Hunter, or Werewolf and where they stand in the 5th edition of World of Darkness, that's all I've got. Subscribe for more nonsense on the spooky to strange spectrum, or follow my Blue Sky for irregular updates on videos, unrelated projects, and misadventures. I have been Ignacio Vitalis, thank you for watching, and may the night treat you right.